We've got enough people who are now in the room with us to get things underway. So I will formally say hello and introduce myself. Hello, I'm James Kirkup. I'm the director of the Social Market Foundation. Thank you very much for joining us today for our panel debate today, which we're bringing you in partnership with our friends at Policy at Manchester, which is the policy engagement wing of the University of Manchester, which works like us really at the SMF to, I guess, bring some knowledge and learning to the world of public policy. So we're very pleased to work with Policy at Manchester on events like these and other things. Not much housekeeping from me today. Just in terms of running order, I will probably redundantly introduce our panel in a second, because you know who they all are because you signed up for the event, and anyway you can read. But I'll do that anyway. I will we'll hear from the panel, from each of the panelists with opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions, as many questions as possible from you all in the audience, please. When we get to questions, choose your route for trying to ask questions. You can raise the electronic hand thing. I'll try and keep an eye on the panel. You can use the chat panel or the Q&A panel. I'll do my best to keep up with all of them. Depending on how many of you want to ask questions, we will try and put you on camera, or at least on audio, so you can actually put your questions directly to the panel if you'd like. If I've got a ton of questions, we have got quite a lot of people attending today, I might have to précis some of your questions possibly in batches, and that way we can get through as many as possible. When we do get to the question phase, if you are asking a question on camera or on audio, just bear in mind that the audio of this event, I mean, this is a public event. The audio, the video of this event will stay online forever. So your words will be immortalized to the internet for all time. It's a cozy, friendly surrounding setting here, but you are also speaking to the whole the internet when you do questions. That's a very helpful reminder to our panelists, as well. But I'm sure they all know that. I mean, what we're here to talk about today, and I'm not going to even try to offer many thoughts on it, because all of our panelists are far more expert and interesting on the story than I am. I think it really goes to one of the really big interesting trends, not just in education, not just in social policy, but almost across the board for almost every bit of work we do, certainly at the SMF. To the idea of the importance of well-being, happiness, mental health, and how do we incorporate that into more of what we all do collectively and individually. In this case, via education, via the school system. So lots of questions, I think, to be discussed. I'll be quite interested to forewarn the panel. I'll be quite interested to try and get some thoughts from you about some of the wider lessons from this topic, not just for your domain of education, but slightly wider application to other bits of policy. But actually, chances are I might not go for ask the questions, because we've got we've got so many clever, interesting people I can see in the panel already, or who will be keen to ask questions. Anyway, I've now burnt up slightly more than 4 of our 60 minutes of this event by talking, and I promise that is the longest bit of blethering on you're going to hear from me for the rest of this event. I will, in a second, hand over to Professor Neil Humphrey from the University of Manchester, who will then be followed by Kadra Abdinasir from the Centre for Mental Health. And finally, we will have a magisterial upsum and inspiring vision of a shining city on a hill from the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, Kate Green. And then your questions. So you'll be happy to know I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Neil, Professor Humphrey.
Okay, thank you, James. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Neil Humphrey. I'm the Sarah Fielden Chair in Psychology of Education at the University of Manchester. Absolutely delighted and very honoured to be able to speak today at what I think is a really important event on a topic which is absolutely central to everything that we should be thinking about in terms of our society at the moment. I'm going to very briefly give you a little bit of context about well-being and mental health of young people and why it matters so much. And then I'm going to spend more of my time talking to you about one of the ways in which we're hoping Greater Manchester can support the well-being of pupils in the coming years. So just in terms of the general context, I think, probably most people on this that have signed up for this event, I'm assuming you will agree that mental health and well-being are of critical importance. If you're not convinced, the research tells us that young people's well-being is concurrently and prospectively associated with their attainment. So their mental health and well-being, feeds into their attainment. It also predicts, adult health, labour market, and other outcomes. But it's also critically important in its own right. It's a fundamental element of young people's development and lives is their kind of experience in relation to well-being. In terms of mental health difficulties, we know the kind of teenage years are particularly important. Most lifetime cases of mental health problems begin during adolescence. And we know also that even prior to COVID, there were some worrying signs in terms of increases in mental health difficulties among children and young people. What we also know with the research that's gone on since the pandemic began is that the pandemic has only served to exacerbate mental health and well-being difficulties among young people. So the prevalence of young people who experience significant difficulties in relation to things like anxiety and so on has grown significantly. So it was important before the pandemic, and it's even more important now. And what we also see from some of the emerging research looking at the pandemic in terms of young people's mental health outcomes is that it served to exacerbate inequalities that were already there within society. So things that we knew were already inequality issues in relation to mental health have been brought into sharp focus in terms of the pandemic. In terms of why school is so central, I think my starting point is to say schools are absolutely central to how we can better support pupil well-being, but they cannot do this alone. So one of my key arguments is going to be that, schools are absolutely central, but schools need support. This needs to be, there's that phrase of mental health and well-being being everybody's business, and that's absolutely what this needs to be in terms of a strategy going forward. So schools are crucial, but they cannot do this on their own. Why schools are so crucial? Schools are a central developmental context for young people. It's where development, it's where lots of socialization is happening. Many of the key influences on young people's well-being operate in and through schools. So things like bullying and friendship formation, all those kinds of things. Young people tell us that school and the pressures of school and exam stress are key factors that influence their well-being. Teachers are the first port of call for many parents. If parents are worried about their children's mental health, the research tells us that they are most likely to contact somebody from the child's school. And schools can do a lot. So schools can provide an environment that's nurturing and supportive where young people feel safe and happy. They can identify, assess and monitor young people's mental health, and I'll say a little bit more about our new project in a second. They can provide direct support for young people's well-being. So there's good research that suggests that with appropriate training, members of school staff can provide kind of universal and some targeted support that can be really effective in improving young people's well-being. But then they can also act as a referral hub when young people need more intensive specialist services. So schools have got that really kind of central role. What I want to finish with is to just talk you through a little bit about some of the work that's starting in Greater Manchester in terms of schools and other organisations that can support young people's wellbeing. So we're beginning the Greater Manchester Young People's Wellbeing Programme. The starting premise of that is that young people's wellbeing needs to be absolutely central to the recovery process. This programme builds on the foundations of some previous work in the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So Greater Manchester for the last 3 years has been doing a life readiness survey, looking at how young people feel about their futures, which is obviously critical in terms of well-being and kind of optimism and hope and what might lie beyond school. And also our Head Start programme, which was a National Lottery Community Fund programme. So we build on those two programmes, and we're working in partnership with the Combined Authority, with its 10 constituent local authorities, And we're hoping as many of the 270 or so secondary schools within the Greater Manchester area. And we've got a growing coalition alongside us of kind of local and national actors. So we're working, for example, with City in the Community, the Manchester United Foundation, 42nd Street, Place to Be, a whole host of local and national actors to try and make wellbeing everybody's business. We're already working with some Pathfinder schools. So, for example, Altrincham Girls Grammar School in Trafford, which is obviously Kate's neck of the woods, to help us think through the project, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. We're starting to recruit schools in May to tell them, that we'd like to work with them and the information about what it will involve. And our starting point here is that we want to work with everybody. So this isn't something that will just be about working with mainstream schools. This is going to be working with all providers of education at the secondary level, special schools, PRUs, alternative provision, and we hope also young people who are not currently engaged in education via youth providers. So what will we do? Well, we believe that what we need in order to be better supporting young people's wellbeing is to better understand it. So we're undertaking a massive kind of scale, effective kind of standardized assessment and monitoring process. So we will be surveying young people across the city region and using the data. So the data that we will capture will be about their well-being, but also the drivers of their well-being in order to provide an unprecedented data set that then all of those local and national actors and the combined authority and schools and local authorities can better understand young people's lives and use that insight to actually plan what they do and how they can do things differently, innovate. We're going to be building communities of practice among schools and allied professionals. We're going to be taking a place-based approach because we know there is such variation in terms of the resources and challenges across a big city region like Greater Manchester. And working then with youth clubs, sport clubs, businesses and charities. Again, that central idea of making wellbeing everybody's business. Our long-term aspiration in doing all of that is to trigger a step change. So education, we believe, focuses too much still on narrowly defined educational outcomes as being the be-all and end-all, and that's evident even at the moment in terms of the kind of the catch-up narrative, which seems to be focusing almost entirely on catch-up in relation to learning. So we need to disrupt that narrative and think about, well-being as being of equal importance. Final thing I want to leave you with is young people's views, which are absolutely central to everything that we're doing. So we're engaging young people in everything that we do. We've already been working with them over the last couple of months, and our starting point there, which is what I'll finish on, is how young people define well-being, because we all talk about well-being as adults and we assume we know what that means in relation to young people. What young people have told us so far is that it's about 4 key things. It's about their sense of meaning, purpose and control in their lives, so their feeling of what the future will be like, the extent to which they have agency and can make decisions that alter their life trajectories, understanding themselves and their kind of life satisfaction and psychological well-being, their emotional experiences, so that kind of rich tapestry of emotional experience, which obviously has been a bit of a roller coaster throughout the pandemic, and then centrally their relationships, their feelings of being supported and connected to other people. So that's what young people have told us well-being means to them, and that's our challenge now, is to spend the next few years trying to support that as best we can. That's probably more than 5 minutes. I apologise, James. I'm done.
I think we can. You're forgiven. Thank you, Neil. Just actually two brief things before I hand over to Kadra. So one to say, if none of the lovely people in the audience ask you about it, I'm going to ask you more about the project and about, I guess, from a perspective of policy innovation at the local authority and combine it at authority level, because I think there's some interesting questions in there about how the scope for local level policy actors to do things like this and how it's come about in Manchester. So that's one thing to forewarn you about. The other thing is actually a bit of and because you talked about engaging young people in the in decision making, I have to plug our next event. I'll do this again at the end when we wrap up, but also if you're interested in that sort of in particular, do all join us again at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning for another Policy at Manchester event, which is directly focused on that question of how to engage young people in policy making. So that on a broader level, so we will come back to that. So thank you. Anyway, enough plugging from me, promise. I will now hand over to Kadra.
Thank you, James, and for inviting me to be a part of this discussion today. This is a vital discussion from our perspective, and absolutely echoing what Neil said there. We can't talk about recovery or the return to education without considering the toll the pandemic has had on children and young people's mental health. Much of what I want to say actually really builds on what Neil said previously. I think the government has been making some progress around the delivery of the Green Paper, focusing on mental health in schools, and the Department for Education's Wellbeing for Education Return Programme, a bit of a mouthful. It's been running during the pandemic, but we think they need to go much further. I'd like to highlight 3 key approaches we see as being essential to recovery and return to school in the short to long term. Firstly, the focus on catch-up and discipline, which Neil alluded to already, has really concerned us, and we think this is really unhelpful. Many children and young people may be returning to school and presenting with very challenging behavior because of the distress, the trauma, and the disruption caused to their learning as a result of the pandemic, particularly for children with existing mental health problems or young people with special educational needs and disabilities. This rhetoric around catch-up and discipline is likely very harmful for these groups of young people. While Ofsted have suspended inspections during the pandemic, we've seen that actually through their interim visits, school exclusions have been rising in some areas. And that's why we've been calling for a moratorium on school exclusions in the aftermath of the pandemic. We shouldn't be displacing pupils from education at a time when they need it the most. In the longer term, we really need to think about how we can apply more effective alternative approaches to behavior discipline, and recognizing that is also very much part of young people's mental health and well-being. Secondly, the sector has long been calling for a national program and implementation of a whole school approach to mental health, which takes a much more comprehensive approach than some of the piecemeal initiatives we're currently seeing. And crucially, this is not just about responding to mental health problems, it's also about creating an environment and culture that promotes positive mental health. Implementing this program will build on some of the existing initiatives, such as the rollout of mental health support teams and the national training program for senior leaders, which is currently out for procurement. It also helps boost these initiatives by focusing on other important elements like measuring well-being, like they're doing up in Manchester, staff well-being, training and development, working with families, and schools and colleges working in partnership with the local system. We need to recognize that schools operate and exist within this wider ecosystem. And finally, in the medium to long term, we really need to fundamentally review the education system and some of the pressures that Neil talked about around academic performance, especially the high stakes assessment system that we have at the moment. These have been and still are a major contributing factor to poor mental health for both pupils and staff alike. The evidence is out there, and it's something I hear all the time from young people and school staff. COVID has shown us actually that alternative approaches for teaching and assessments are possible. And I really think we need to be a lot more ambitious in our thinking and acknowledge the fact that, you know, frankly, we have a Victorian education system trying to teach and equip children and young people for a 21st century world. So we really need to, you know, think about more ambitious and more radical approaches. And, you know, now is the time with ideas such as the beverage review and commission that the Children's Commissioner is running. So thank you. I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Kadra. Now, your forewarning, I suppose, and this will be that I'm quite keen to get some more thoughts on that that question of catch up and you know, the rhetoric. You know, essentially look for better ways to talk about the subject, I suppose. So, you know, ideas welcome on that. But we'll come back to that after Kate has given us the aforementioned, the aforepromised magisterial upsum and shining vision of Labour's plans and thoughts on. Sorry, I'm my only slightly flippant. I'm very pleased to have Kate here, and particularly mindful of the fact that we're in the happy point of the electoral cycle, where actually, dare I say it, it's possible to get people on the front benches of both parties at the moment to come along to these events and actually have serious conversations about the development of ideas, because we're a long way from one of those terrible elections where everyone has to shout at each other about things. So I'm really pleased to have Kate here, and keen to hear your thoughts on the topic as a whole. Kate.
I've got to say it's a very unhappy point in the electoral cycle when you've spent 11 years, your entire career in Parliament, in opposition. But we're across. The SMF, as you know, is a cross-party think tank. We take no role in these affairs of politicians. I'm really pleased to be here, though, and really welcome the work that Neil's been describing, the data collection, because I think it is absolutely vital that we understand the nature of the subject that we're talking about and the nuances in it. I think it's really important to say at the outset that while clearly the pandemic has exacerbated underlying mental health issues and concerns about well-being for not just children and young people, but for all of us, some children and young people have done better under the pandemic. There have been some who have thrived from being able to be at home more, not being in the school environment. And indeed, we also should recognise that while there are many problems, I think, to identify in relation to non-face-to-face learning, there are benefits too to be gleaned from remote learning. It's allowed young people to study at their own pace, to go back over material that they want to understand better. And so I think it's really important that we take the good out of what we've learned from the last 12 months, as well as address what has clearly been an incredibly difficult time for a lot of children and young people. And Neil, I hope that your project will give us a really good insight into both the things we want to build on and develop, as well as the things that we need to address and correct. And I also want to say that, well, of course, I absolutely agree with both Neil and Kadra about the importance of well-being in and of itself. It's part of the human condition to live a good, fulfilled life. It is really important, as Neil said, for children's educational attainment. If we don't address children's well-being as a prerequisite for their learning, then we are going to inhibit the educational recovery, which is really important to me as Shadow Secretary of State for Education. And it is not acceptable to me that we have a growing attainment gap between the most disadvantaged children and other children. It isn't good enough to say that we're just going to remove all the pressure from the education system because disadvantaged children are struggling. We've got to correct those problems in the education system so that every child and young person can reach their full potential. That's really important for them, for their life chances, for their future earnings potential. It's really important for our country. We can't afford to waste the potential of anyone and the contribution they can make to our future success and prosperity. And I think a lot about some of the structural solutions that we're going to need, because what we have got at the moment, obviously, is a short-term strategy around holiday activities and a food programme. And we've got the appointment of Kevin Collins, which I think is widely welcomed in the sector, but only for 9 months. And I think what is really important is that we can actually embed long-term structural change that will place well-being at the heart of the way that our education system works for children and young people, and indeed for adult learners. We need a long-term strategy and we need sustainable funding. And at the moment, we have neither of those in place. I'm very interested in Kadra's point about the whole school approach. And I think that is right. We have to attend not just to the well-being of children and young people, but of everybody who works in the school environment. If we don't have healthy and well professionals, then they can't be teaching children and young people to reach their full potential. And I would also say that in addition to a whole school approach, we need to, as I think you were suggesting earlier, have a whole society approach. The schools and colleges are not divorced from what's going on in the wider world. And that means we need a cross-government strategy, we need a multi-agency strategy, and we need multi-agency delivery on the ground. And something that we really don't have at the moment. Indeed, it's very difficult to get that holistic approach in public policy, to observe that holistic approach in public policy today. So if you look, for example, at the Skills White Paper, there's no mention really of mental health and well-being in that. If you look at the health and social care proposals that the government's bringing forward, there's no reference to what's going on in education. We need to start thinking about this in a much more joined up way. I pick up the points that both Kadra and Neil make about change within the education system, around curriculum, around accountability and around assessment, and those are important. We're not talking here about compromising on educational standards. We absolutely are not. I really believe that does let down the most disadvantaged young people if we start to suggest that that somehow is of secondary importance. It is not. And nor should we throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, there are things that are important about having a robust accountability regime, about having an objective assessment process, about having a curriculum that gives young people both knowledge and skills and the ability to live in what is a very complex and uncertain future, make decisions and choices, evaluate and critically question information, seek out and research knowledge for themselves. And so this is not, for me, cannot be allowed to be something that's just soft and cuddly. We really do want it to produce outcomes for our children and young people that make this the best place in the world for them to grow up in, Keir Starmer's aspiration, but actually also enables them to achieve and attain. And so I'm really pleased to be part of this discussion this afternoon. Very much looking forward to hearing not just what my fellow panelists, but the wider audience have to say. I don't think this is going off the agenda. I think that the real change the pandemic has brought is to make well-being now centre stage in the discussion about our education system, what it's for, and my particular interest and the interest of the government too in attainment and achievement at every stage of the system. And we mustn't lose that. We mustn't let go of that. It's a real opportunity and really good to have this event and a chance to explore some of the ideas that we want to take forward today.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you to all the panel. So before I start going out to the audience for your questions, there's a couple of questions from me, I suppose, or hopefully well telegraphed. I mean, the first one really primarily to Neil is just to ask you, Neil, to expand a little bit on the project that you're undertaking in Manchester and essentially how that came about, and what are the necessary components for that sort of innovation. So we have people from essentially across the sector, from different geographical location, different bits of the policy world here. What were the necessary components for your project to take off in Manchester? Interested in any thoughts that Kadra and Kate have on what again, local level policy actors away from from Kate's domain of Westminster can do to help build an evidence base on this topic. And then after we talk about that a little bit, I want to come back to that question of the catch-up narrative. But Neil, the key components for your project.
Yeah. Okay. So this came about, as I said, so it's the confluence of kind of a few things. So we've been doing this project called Head Start, which is a National Lottery Community Fund project, working in areas like Cornwall, Blackpool, Wolverhampton, and various places up and down the country, where we developed the kind of the methodology, if you like, the approach to kind of using big data to provide schools with information that they can use in terms of their planning their provision, and they're supported in doing that by the Child Outcomes Research Consortium. So that's another key thing that I forgot in my whistle-stop tour is the feedback that's provided for schools and other agencies and actors in this whole process. There is support available from Cork to kind of work as a kind of critical external partner to think through problems and areas of need and what might be done about them. In terms of the kind of the critical ingredients, we worked. The key thing with this whole process for us is about willing partners and collaborators. So I kind of rattled off a list, but it starts with the combined authority, who, are deeply committed to young people and young people's well-being. It's been a key tenet of the mayor's kind of period in office is around young people and their aspirations and their well-being. So that's been a kind of critical ingredient. But the willing partners across the system, so not just schools, as I said, but all of the other organisations that are working with us, working alongside us on this. These kinds of projects cannot happen without those willing partners. But I think, Manchester, Greater Manchester is the perfect place to do that. We like to do things a little differently in Manchester. And it's just been, the confluence of all those things alongside then, this was a project, I should say, this was a project that we planned even before the pandemic. The pandemic kind of, has accelerated and focused our passion for doing this, but we actually were already starting to plan this before March of last year, and this has just kind of strengthened our resolve. So it's very much about the partnership and collaboration across the city region that's made this happen, but it's also that partnership and collaboration that can, drive the support for young people's well-being. Thank you very much.
On the same thing, Kadra, do you have any, from your perspective, can you see other examples of good local level innovation, or more opportunities out there for evidence gathering and I suppose a bit of advocacy on this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would just add to Neil's point, this idea of leadership as well. I think we see that a bit being quite variable across the country, and with real leadership, we can see significant change and innovation happening locally. I just wanted to point out that the government's ongoing transformation program for children and young people's mental health, Future in Mind, is coming to an end, I think, the end of this month. And with that, there was actually a requirement for local areas to come together as partners to develop local transformation plans. And in order to receive funding from central government, they had to publish and produce these plans together in collaboration with local communities. And I would really love it for that kind of work to continue post this time. And Manchester was a great example of that. Liverpool, Leeds, there's lots of great collaborative planning and strategizing work around that. I think the legacy of that is something that hopefully we can hold on to and continue.
Thank you. Kate, that's pretty teed up a relatively easy answer to you about how to encourage local level innovation, which you can just say elect more Labour mayors. But beyond cloning Andy Burnham, how do you think people away from your level of governance out there in the country can support more innovative evidence gathering here?
Well, I think it's hard for them to do it, James, if the accountability and incentive regime in which they're working actually actively works against their doing it. And that is the situation to a degree that we've got right now. So, we were talking a few moments ago about Ofsted and the things Ofsted does measure and the things that it doesn't. The fact that we've got a very fragmented education system, which means local authorities don't have all the levers. They can't now make a lot of schools do anything because the schools are no longer maintained schools under direct local authority control. And the fact that we haven't, we've got local government in particular, has seen huge pressure on resources. And so I think to say, what can local initiatives do? They need to be doing it within a framework that actually incentivizes, recognizes, supports and rewards them for doing the right things. And I don't think we have that at the moment. I do think leadership is really important. Local leadership is really important. Neil referenced, Andy Burnham making this a priority and talking about it. And I think talking about it is important because we need parents, we need educators to believe this is important. And at the moment, it's hard for teachers to think it's important when they're being measured on something else. And for parents, it's worrying if they think their own child is not going to benefit or is falling behind. That will naturally be the focus of a parent's concern. And so we need to be able to give parents confidence that doing this is in the interest of their child and is genuinely about their child's success. And I think, we've got a system at the moment where all the wrong things are incentivized, where exclusions are incentivized because they take the problem off your school roll, where admissions policies don't encourage schools to admit and then work with the children who need the greatest support, where we've got an Ofsted inspection regime that doesn't actually reward schools, recognize schools and put into the league tables, the things that they are doing really well in this area. And so, there are some great initiatives, and Kadra's right. We've all got them in our areas. We can point to schools that are doing really brilliant stuff. But I think it's very, very hard to ask them to do that when you've got an incentives and a recognition regime that's all wrong.
Thank you. Now, the next, I've got some questions starting to flow in on the Q&A panel. Actually, and comments on this question of local delivery. I've got more a comment from David Pace, who I think is involved with the Include MI wellbeing app, which is currently being tested in several local authorities, including Derby City Council. So we have more innovation going on there. But the other topic I want to ask you all about, and I think it was something that Neil and Kadra both raised, was the catch-up narrative, the rhetoric, and how that is interacting with mental health and well-being. Because I don't know. I'll sound mildly skeptical, I suppose, or questioning on this. Can I just check the reservation, the hesitation about talking about catch-up from your perspective, Neil, Kadra, possibly yours, Kate, too? Are we essentially talking about the language we use to describe an issue? The issue, as I say, is that, as Kate alluded to, the pandemic experience has not been equal. That it has, in some cases, widened some gaps, some attainment gaps, and that is something that, in terms of an attainment-led approach, needs to be addressed. But so the objection to talking about that in terms of catch-up is not, no one's objecting to the idea that it is, that work needs to be done to help children close that attainment gap. But it's the language that's the issue. Is that right, or is there a deeper problem here? I don't know who. I'm looking at both of you, Neil and Kadra, on this. I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I think the language is incredibly important, because the language that we choose to use in relation to young people sends them a message, and it's part of a broader kind of discourse. I think that all the talk about a lost generation, it's all kind of problematizing young people in a way that I think's unhelpful. So the language is incredibly important, and I think there are ways that we could talk about the work that needs to be done, which takes a much more kind of strengths-based, kind of positive youth development type approach. But absolutely, the work definitely still needs to be done, right? But then within the work itself, what I said in my opening kind of statement in the first 5 minutes is, the focus of the work that's planned seems to be so centrally on, like, we need to sort out kids' exams, it's to the exclusion of all else. We need to, and my worry is within that, to the exclusion of well-being and other aspects of young people's lives that are equally important. But that also, by some of the ways in which this kind of catch-up in inverted commas is being planned, what young people tell us, my worry is actually some of that will be in conflict with the work to support well-being. So if we're talking about, things like extending the school day and work over the summer, all those kinds of things, young people tell us about the stresses and kind of pressures that they feel already in the school system, even with, so we need to be more sensitive in the way that we do this. And I think I'll hand over to Kadra, but I think, I wonder, with all of this kind of narrative around catch-up, to what extent they've run this past young people in terms of, they need to be, the government needs to be thinking about the way in which they communicate to the public more generally, but with these kinds of messages, actually consulting with young people in the first instance about the language would be a really good starting point.
Thank you. And I mean, in a way that slightly preempts the question I was going to sort of refine and put to Kadra, which is, if this is a communication question, Kadra, what's a better way of talking about the challenges that we're discussing here? Can you think of a better framing that would help make for more positive conversations?
Yeah, I think just building on what Neil said, I don't think it is just a communication issue. I think some of the ideas being shared around longer school days and actually reducing the curriculum and taking out things around extracurricular activities and arts and physical education, health education, and focusing more on the core academic subjects is of concern to us. I think we definitely need to reframe it and understand the fact that well-being and attainment go hand in hand, and the two are intrinsically linked. If pupils are struggling with their mental health, they're not going to perform well in school. And academic pressures can also fuel mental health problems amongst some young people. So I think I would echo Neil's point about actually speaking and involving young people. I don't think they've had an opportunity throughout this entire pandemic to actually inform and be consulted. You know, the minister in Scotland actually held briefings dedicated for children and young people. We've not seen anything like that happening here. And ultimately, academic development, of course, is very, very important, but we also need to think about physical, emotional, and social development alongside these things, especially as the world that it is now is going to be increasingly challenging for young people in terms of getting into employment and starting off their life in adulthood. So these things have equal value and importance, and you know, schools need to have that wraparound support as well from other professionals in order to do that.
Thank you, Kate. Do you want to come in on this on this point about the catch-up narrative, or shall we go on to questions from the audience?
I just would say very quickly, I mean, I've heard a lot about this concern about the narrative, and I'm not really in a position to comment on that, except that, you know, clearly it commands a very broad number of people who are concerned about it. I don't think we should compromise on the fact that there has been serious and significant learning loss, which we need to address and compensate for. And it's not a quick fix. We're not going to compensate for it with 1 year of a national tutoring programme and a summer holiday activities programme. This needs to be a sustained effort, with children's and young people's wellbeing as one element of that sustained effort, and a very important element. But we can't turn this into an excuse for not being ambitious for children's attainment. And we've got to be robust about the way that we measure that. And you know, if we don't know that some children are falling behind, they will fall further behind. So it's really important. I think Neil's data is such an important component of what we're going to know about children and young people's development and recovery. Their academic performance and measuring that is a very important piece of data, set of data that we will need to have and look to as well.
Thank you. Now, just before I come to questions, now, to forewarn my colleagues and her, the first person I'll bring in for a question in a second is Angelique Richardson, if that's okay with you, Angelique, and my colleague might turn on your microphone in a second. But before I do that, Kate, can I just briefly ask? So, Kadra mentioned the government sort of floating ideas around changing the school day and particularly the school year. What's the Labour view of that sort of that structural change to try and address the lost learning you mentioned?
It's not just about more time, it's about what you do with your time. You know, I'm entirely in favour of using time around the school day, time in the holidays for extended activities. Entirely in favour of that. I'm not in favour of trying to teach maths to kids who are exhausted and demotivated at 6 o'clock in the evening. I'm not very much in favour of teaching adults much at 6 o'clock in the evening either. We're all tired. So I think your schools are a great resource. They've got great facilities, great equipment. You know, we should be making much more use of them. But that doesn't mean that we're using them solely to have kids more in the classroom, having more face-to-face formal learning. We should be extending school. The extended school concept is about more than just extending the day to teach kids more of the academic curriculum. It's about being able to make a much broader and richer offer to them of the activities that support their well-being and therefore their learning. And in terms of the school year, I mean, the school year is clearly designed for all sorts of pre-industrial notions of when you know how family life and working life is lived, and I'm sure that it's not a new idea that we ought to have a look at that. But I would venture to say that right now, as we're trying to recover from the first pandemic in a century, that's probably not our top priority. That there are other things that we need to and will do first to really make up for the damage that the pandemic has done.
Thank you. Now, hopefully, do we have Angelique able to ask a question, or shall I?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Angelique, go ahead.
Thanks very much. So I'm speaking from higher education. I think there's a lot of scope for working with schools. I do a lot of work with schools myself, but just hearing what the excellent presentations were saying, about working with young people. Something we talk about, some of us in higher education, is active compassion. So involving everyone right from the outset. I'm sure Neil knows about this if the others don't. And I wondered if that's something that schools could do more with, thinking about that point about agency. And I also wanted further to that to pick up on Neil's point about language. I entirely understand that, as Kate said, we need robust measurement. We need not to lose the focus on attainment and ambition. But I would make a plea for what Neil said about really paying attention to the language used. When you talk about a lost generation, young people hear that and they feel lost. We've got to be really careful about the way in which we use language, because it's not just descriptive.
Thank you, Angelique. I think that's really a question pretty first to Neil about the about active compassion, and any further, any follow-up thoughts on that from Kadra and Kate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a perfect example of the kind of thing that we can and should be promoting in schools and in other contexts. So this is all about, the kind of practice of understanding and wanting to support other people. And we know that engaging in those kinds of practices of active compassion will help other people's well-being, but it also helps our own well-being. So people may be familiar with things like the 5 ways to well-being model, and helping others is one of the ways in which we can kind of promote our own well-being. So this is these kinds of practices, which might look different and might be practiced differently across different schools. There's no kind of one silver bullet way of doing these things, but it's exactly that kind of thing that I think is, and it doesn't cost the earth. It's something that we know can boost young people's well-being. So absolutely, I think Angelique is spot on there.
Thank you.
Kadra and Kate, up to you if you have thoughts from comment on that, or I can move on. Just depending on, up to you.
Yeah, just really quickly, I guess one of the core components of a whole school approach is actually youth voice and involving pupils in decision making. So absolutely, that could be done in a school setting. And actually, schools in Denmark, when they were reopening their schools, invited pupils to actually be involved in making the school a COVID secure setting. And I think something like that is so powerful in terms of like young people adhering to the rules that they have a say in and co-creating a code. So that can absolutely be done both in this context and in the longer term.
Thank you. Kate, is that one for you, or shall I go to our next questioner?
Go on to the next one, because I know there are lots there.
Well, the next question is coming from Angelica Fernandez, and I can hopefully we can we get at? Oh,
thank you. My question is, some families decided to homeschool kids because for pre-existing conditions they feel at risk of being badly affected by the virus. But it seems that families have been left out of policies or even budget. There is nothing, a strategy or anything allocated for them to help to reinforce education to their kids. Thank you.
So that's essentially a question about families who have either had to or have chosen the homeschooling route, and are they being left out of the conversation, left out of policy a little here? Anybody want to go first on that one, or I'll pick someone?
I'm quite happy to talk about this, actually. Homeschooling is not a straightforward issue. It never is a straightforward issue, because it works very well for some children where parents are able to give them all the support and enriching learning that enables them to thrive. But it's also used as a means for school to off-roll and exclude children without going through the formalities and processes that would actually protect those children, and ought to be keeping them in school, the best place for the vast majority of children's learning and social and emotional well-being. And so I very much support initiatives being led at the moment through a private member's bill to try and create a register of homeschooled children. The government agrees with this, I think, but it's taking a very long time to bring forward any legislation. But I think we've got to be very robust about homeschooling, that it's what sort of homeschooling is it, and is it in the best interests of all children, or is it being as a means of actually getting some of the children who ought to be getting a better education in school than they are, just off the books and overlooked? And I'm unhappy about that. I also think that I support the compulsory return to school on the 8th of March. I think that's the right thing. Labour's always said we wanted schools to be the last place to close, the first to reopen. We've always said school is the best place for children's social and emotional well-being, for being with their peers, their teachers, and for their learning. And I think that the messaging to parents hasn't always offered them enough reassurance about that being the case, that the best place for their children will be in school. We've had muddled messaging about the clinically vulnerable and the clinically extremely vulnerable. Schools have put in a lot of work to make their premises as COVID secure as they can, but they haven't always been supported with resources from the government. We've had confusing messaging about children and young people's susceptibility to the virus and to their ability to spread infection. And I think all of that has created worry and anxiety among some parents, which really doesn't serve the best interests of anyone, hasn't served the best interests of families, and doesn't serve the best interests of their children. And I worry too that the government's punitive language that we were talking about earlier, about fines and that kind of ethos, it isn't the right way to bring children back into school where it's the best place for them to be. What parents need is information and reassurance. And for me, that's the answer. The answer isn't to say, what more can we do to support more homeschooling? The answer is to say, what more can we do to reassure parents that school is the best place for their children and make sure that that is the case?
Thank you. Neil and Kadra, I think that may in fact end up being our last question of the session, because I realize we only have barely 5 minutes left. But Neil, obviously your project focus is on sort of data collection via schools, but do you have a homeschool element in the project as well?
Not homeschool per se, but we are having conversations about the need to reach young people who are not in school for a variety of reasons. And that may be because they're homeschooled, it may be because they're not currently engaged in education. And so, I go back to the point that I made in the initial presentation, which is we want to include as many of the schools and as many of the young people in Greater Manchester as we can in this project. And, some of those young people aren't going to be physically in school when we're doing our surveys. And so we want to work very hard to try and make sure that if they want to participate, that they can still do so. And that's just then about us developing strategies to be able to reach those young people, whether it's via the home or whether it's via youth workers or whether it's via some other means, so that we're not just capturing the views of young people who happen to be attending school, we're capturing the views across the whole range of young people in the city region.
Thank you very much. Kadra, both any thoughts on that question of homeschooling, but also it's effectively going to become closing thoughts as well, since I think we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I think, homeschooling is a phenomenon that was rising exponentially even before the pandemic, and the pandemic's brought around lots of challenges. I think the last message, I guess, from me would be the Department for Education and the Minister for Education and Family and the Mental Health Minister have recently set up a Mental Health Education Action Group. I really think they do need to consider all of these points that we've been talking about here today as part of their work, including those children not in formal education as well, and taking a really inclusive approach. I really hope, the mental health champion, Dr. Alex George, who was appointed, is speaking and listening to children across the country and, feeding that back into some of the plans they're developing. So I think, yeah, the big thing for me would be that whatever initiatives they come up, I don't think a low cost, no cost approach is going to work. So I do hope that that plan is backed up by some sufficient funding to address the range of topics and issues we've talked about today. Thank you very much. Now, as I will probably bring things to
a graceful close there, since we have about 180 seconds left. One last thought, I'll just throw at you. It's coming on the Q&A from David Pace, actually, again, so just saying I'd be interested in the panel's views about the new NHS integrated care systems, which obviously is a whole day's worth of conversation in itself about the NHS role here, but that's something we will hopefully come back to. So thank you for that, David. I will, unless any of our panelists have any further burning thoughts they want to share, I will say thank you very much to all of you, to Neil Humphrey, to Kadra Abdinasir, and to Kate Green for joining us. Thank you especially to Policy at Manchester for working with us to do these events. I think I'm right in saying, Neil, you've written a blog about the project and next steps, which is, I've forgotten, has that been published, or is it about to be published on the Policy at Manchester website?
I think it's either just been published or it will be within the next 24 hours.
It is Schrödinger's blog. It is in a state of publication and unpublication. We're unsure which at the moment, but do have a look at that if you'd like to hear more about the project. And the final bit of plugging. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone, the Deus Ex Machina. One of my colleagues is telling me you all. I think all attendees will be getting a link to that blog after the event, so look out for that in your inboxes. And as the final plug, I would give it almost in many ways the sort of the continuity of this conversation will be back here on SMF Pixels at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning, again with Policy at Manchester. Our academic friend there is Deborah Rawls, and demonstrating our cross-party-ness, or whatever the word is, we'll have Andrew Bowie, Conservative MP, and I think Vice Chair of the Conservative Party for Young Persons and Youth, who will be talking about, giving us his views on how to answer that question of integrating the views of young people in policymaking across the board. So if you enjoyed today, I hope you have. I have. I'll certainly be here on Tuesday morning. Hope you will all be too. But for now, again, thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Policy at Manchester. Have a lovely rest of the day.